recording in the basement and people are squeaking around, so please forgive the squeaks in the background if there are any. Okay, Marigoul asked me to do a video on lettering and bubble placement. I'll be real, I put this one off a little bit because I had to double check my research to make sure I wasn't doing any horrible lettering mistakes. I did my research, I'll tell you my findings. So you have your nice bubble drawn. How do you put the text in the bubble? Since bubbles are circular, you want to format your text so that it's in a diamond or football shape. So you've probably seen it if you read comics, but basically the middle line of your letters is going to be the longest line of text. And then the lines sandwiching it are going to get shorter and shorter until you hit the bottom. So imagine you've put like a little diamond or a football inside your bubble. That's how your text should look. It should fit inside the little diamond. Text should be center aligned, not left aligned, like say a book's paragraphs would be. Oh, don't be afraid of putting one word on its own line, say at the beginning or the end of the bubble, like the top or the bottom. Like, if you study graphic design at all, they tell you not to leave orphans, which means having, like, one word on its own at the bottom of a paragraph. That's totally okay with comic bubbles because of the way comic bubbles are shaped. It just looks really nice. Also make sure to give lots of, like, breathing room to your letters. Like, don't hug the edges or the outline of the bubble right to the letters. Like, give it some pixel width, like not so much that it's like tiny and alone in the center of the bubble, but like not so little that it's like uncomfortably close. Just look at some comics you like and see how they do their bubbles, kind of see the spacing there. Also make sure to keep your letters a uniform size. So like keep your font at like, say you choose 10 pixels, for example, for your font, for your text. Make sure that in all your bubbles, it's always 10 pixels. Unless, your character's shouting, in case the font would be bigger, or if they're whispering, the font would be smaller. Keep it consistent. It'll keep it easy to read. Don't change it. Like, it's really good for consistency, but don't change it unless you have a good reason to. It'll just be easier to read. And easier on you, because you don't have to worry about changing the size every time. Like any kind of typography, make sure there's like a good amount of leading, which is the space between lines of text. So like, depending on what size your text is, like the pixel size will determine the pixel width between lines. But like if you ever used a Word doc where you can choose between like 1.2 spacing or 1.5, that kind of size is good. You don't want your letters so close that they're all, like, cramped and touching, but you don't want them so far away that they don't look like they're part of the same paragraph or piece of wording. And same with the kerning, which is the space between letters. Ensure that the letters aren't grouped together super tightly, and make sure they're not so far apart that they look like you've chopped up the sentence, or chopped up the word into little bits. Also, this goes for lettering in your comic, and it also goes for typography in general. Don't squish or stretch your font. Don't do it. Don't make it taller. Don't make it wider by like skewing it and stretching it. Leave the font alone. Let it do its own thing. It tends to look tacky and like weirdly photoshopped, and just don't do it. Unless you have a really good reason. But that goes for like anything. And always ensure there's enough contrast in your bubbles. So a good rule of thumb is use black text on a white background or use white text on a black background. If you're going to use color, get as close to that contrast as possible. If you're using yellow letters, put it on a dark background. If you're using like dark red letters, put it on a light background. Make sure your contrast is there so people can read the words. Super important. Now, with the actual fonts and typefaces you want to choose, I tend towards kind of comic fonts. Like if you go on Blambot, that's a great website to get free comic fonts. You'll find a whole bunch of them there that are designed to be readable in comic format. Avoid serif and sans serif fonts. So like anything from Helvetica to like Times New Roman to Georgia or whatever. Like avoid all those because they're really great in like big paragraphs of text, especially depending on if you're like print or screen. You can dig into typography if you want. However, for comics, they tend to look weird. Go for comic formats. They're traditional for a reason. They work. Like, for serif fonts, I've seen a few comics, especially ones that are like historical comics, get away with serif fonts, but tread lightly. And also, when you're choosing your font, make sure that your eyes have crossbars. So like, you know, the letter I, how like sometimes it's a stick, or sometimes it's a stick with like a horizontal bar on top and bottom. If your character is saying I, as in like I am, make sure the I has that crossbar. If it's the beginning of a word like the word imagine, make your I a little stick. If you're doing that, I mean, like most comic fonts come with that, but if you're doing it, make sure it's consistent. Because you can either have the crossbars for like the proper I's, or honestly, having the crossbars just makes it more legible because you're probably going to have like an I by itself a lot of the time. So it'll make it a bit more readable when it's in like this little bubble. Anyways, I digress. But yeah, make sure you're consistent. If you're going to include the crossbar I's, use them consistently through your work. If you're not going to include them, don't smatter them places. Just don't include them if you don't need to. So that covers the lettering and typography, at least when it comes to speech bubbles. Sound effects. Sound effects are like a whole other bag. But now I'll get into bubble placement. The biggest piece of advice I can always give is make sure you plan where your bubbles are going. Don't throw them in at the last minute and like shove them off to the corner because you don't want to cover up your pretty artwork. Make sure you plan it in when you're doing your thumbnail sketches, when you're doing your pencils. Make sure they're there. Because they're part of the composition, they contribute to the flow of the comic. Make sure they're there. I've heard some people, when they talk about the tails of bubbles, to point them at faces, which is good solid advice, don't get me wrong, because you want to be able to tell who's speaking, so the best practice is to point the tail toward their face. Like, don't have it touching their face, but have it pointing in their direction. I've heard that, like, putting the end of the tail halfway between the face and the edge of the bubble is a good frame of reference. However, I tend to use bubble tails as a way to kind of point the reader in the direction I want them to go. So like if I want them to look at this character first, and then the next character second, I'll point the bubble kind of around the person, and then it points to the speaker. Or like, if I want them to look at the top of the panel before they look at the bottom, I can use the bubble tail to do that. Like subtly, it's usually just one curve, it's not like a wibbly wobbly line. But anyways, don't be afraid to experiment a little bit with your bubble tails, because you can use them for flow, and at the same time, you know, show who's speaking. It's up to you. The only other advice I'd give for bubble placement is keep them out of your gutters. So your gutters are like the space between panels. Gutters signify a change in time, or a passage of time. So sticking your bubble in the gutter means this sentence that's being spoken is happening over a length of time. So keep your bubbles out of your gutters unless you're trying to do that. Because usually when I see bubbles in the gutters, I immediately think, oh, they didn't plan where they wanted to put their bubble. So make sure that the bubble is inside the panel. Like, don't get me wrong, if you have intention behind it, do it. But generally keep your bubble inside the panel. It's fine if it like the panel edge like cuts off the bubble, so it's not like a full circle. That's totally fine. I also don't mind when people like take the panel edge and like clip the bubble into it so it's part of the panel edge. That's totally cool too. Makes for a cool composition and framing. The way I do it generally is I just keep the bubble from touching the edge, but like, do whatever you want with that. It's your composition, you do what you gotta do. There you go. That is all I have about lettering and bubble placement. I hope that helps. I learned a lot of it through trial and error and kind of like following what I saw in my experience reading comics. So like you can do a lot of cool, crazy things compositionally, but at least with lettering, just make sure that it's like you can read it clearly. Don't get too fancy with the fonts unless you're like, you know, you have a character who's supposed to be like speaking a certain way. Like in my comic The Magpie, we use like a scripty font. for whenever the magpie speaks, because she's super flowery and she's like a goddess, so, she gets special font. But generally, just make it easy to read. Keep good contrast. If you're not sure if it's easy to read, show it to people and see if they have like a guttural reaction to it. Oh, and don't use Comic Sans. Don't do it. It makes me think you wanted a comic font, but you didn't know where to look. So don't use it. Alrighty, that's all I have for today. Thank you so much for listening. If you have any questions or if you'd like to request a video topic, please leave a comment down below, and I'll see you next time. Goodbye!